Good evening, good afternoon, or yes, afternoon now as the case may be. Good afternoon, wherever you sort of might be coming from. Welcome to our wonderful little live stream. So we've got a guest joining us today to talk about sort of nationalisation, why it's so important, and especially the campaign around nationalisation. I think we've talked about this before on the channel. In fact, I'm sure we've talked about this before on the channel. A campaign group called We Own It. So I'm going to let the guy himself take it away and introduce himself and tell us more about We Own It and what its objectives are. So take it away.
Thank you so much. Obviously my name. Oh well, I thought that it would show my name at the bottom, but my name is Johnbosco Nwogbo. I'm lead campaigner at We Own It. We Own It campaigns around public services. So we are a voice of public service users. We believe that we fund our public services, we pay for it, we should own it. They should be run for people and not for profit. So we run campaigns around rail, buses, the NHS, energy, water. Water is a big one at the moment with private water companies dumping sewage into our rivers and seas. Yes, and obviously what I would really love to talk about today is our NHS campaign, but I'm also keen, potentially, if that's possible, to talk about some of what's happening in water, perhaps in rail. Labour has just made an important announcement around rail. There are problems with some of that would be interesting to talk about.
Yeah, like I say, I'm here to talk about all. So we'll like I say, well, where do you want to start? So you talked about obviously the NHS one first, because obviously this is really our currently really it's our I say currently at the moment it's our only sort of big sort of nationalised sort of organisation. So why don't you tell us a bit more about sort of your campaign that you've got running and of course its objectives as well?
Yeah, so over the last 14 years, which as we all know has coincided with the Conservative government, what we've seen happen to our NHS are three main things. There are several other things, but three main things underlie a lot of what's happened. One of them is underfunding. We've seen systematic underfunding of the NHS. According to the British Medical Association, if we had funded the NHS at the same rate as we funded the NHS, as the NHS budget grew every year on average between 1955 and 2010, the government would have put an extra £322 billion into the NHS between 2010 and 2024, right? So they have systematically underfunded the NHS to the tune of about 322 billion pounds. And of course, recent analysis by Health Foundation also shows that compared to the rest of Europe, say compared to France, we spend about 40 billion pounds less on our NHS per year than France. We spend 72 billion pounds less per year than Germany. Compared to the average European country, we spend about 40 billion pounds less. So it's one thing that we've seen happen is systematic underfunding. The second thing that we've seen happen is systematic outsourcing of NHS services, right? We've seen cleaning services going out. We've seen cooking, catering services going out. But we've also seen clinical services like checks or tests. We've seen surgeries. We're increasingly seeing surgeries. And of course, the Labour Party is now supportive of the government's policy of outsourcing more NHS surgeries. And we can talk about the effects of that later on. But just describing the kind of general situation. So that's the second thing that has happened. The third thing that has happened over that period is systematic understaffing. The NHS at the moment has 150,000 staff vacancies. About 10,000 of those are doctors. At the same time as we have about 17,000 doctors that are trained by the NHS who are providing surgeries in private hospitals. And a lot of the reason for that explains the reason for the 150,000 staff vacancies we have. We are not paying our nurses and doctors what they deserve. People say doctors earn so much. They do not actually earn a lot, especially junior doctors. But even for the more senior consultants, compared to other countries, we are paying a pittance. We're not competitive at all. And we are seeing thousands and tens of thousands of doctors leave the NHS. And sometimes it's quite interesting because the same people who say that doctors earn too much are the same people who believe in the market, and the market has already set the price for the doctor. Australia is able to pay them more. Canada is able to pay them more. New Zealand is able to pay them more. That's the market. Let's pay them what the market is asking. And even the private sector here in the UK is able to pay them more per surgery. Right. So it's really incredible that over the last 14 years, these three things have essentially brought the NHS to its knees. And COVID played a part, but let's not allow politicians to pretend as though things were hunky-dory before COVID came. Waiting lists were at about between 4 and 5 million during by the time the pandemic came, right? And what we are saying as a result of that is, as we lead up into this general election, it is time for us to mobilize and demand that everybody who is putting themselves forward to be elected an MP commit that they're going to do three things, that are going to support three policies in Parliament. Number one is that they're going to support proper NHS funding of £40 billion more per year for the NHS across the UK. So about, depending on the Barnett formula, about £32 billion more per year in England. And we're going to demand that they do that. Number two, we're going to demand that they bring contracts back into the NHS that are outsourced at the moment when those contracts expire. And number three is that we're demanding that they reinstate the health secretary's legal duty to provide health services in England. This is something that was repealed in 2012 that people don't actually know happened. And the effect of this is that the quality of healthcare that you get right now, wherever you live, depends a great deal more on whether or not your local NHS body is able to manage their budgets well, more than it depends on what the national government is doing. And the reason for that is that the health secretary no longer has a national duty to everybody across the country. The person
I suppose that's really one of the important parts of that, is just sort of bringing that responsibility back to them, sort of really sort of attaching that responsibility to them. And I think that is kind of important, because we do see that, and we'll get onto this probably in a bit more at the moment, that you see this fight happening at the local elections, happening tomorrow. Go out and vote, by the way. just a little reminder to everyone watching. The regional mayors really, really have a lot of responsibilities, especially in public transport, which we'll get onto in a moment. That is something that you've seen Ben Houchen get hounded about recently in his mayoral seat and elections. So I think bringing that and tagging that back importance to them, I think, is very, very important. So definitely agree with you on that one. One of the things I know that the questions that I think is common for sort of, people would sort of bring up against this is, so if we nationalize it, what are we sort of going to do better? I think you've sort of answered some of those questions already, but I just want to sort of would put that sort of question sort of to you again as that. So how would we sort of, with a fully sort of government run sort of service, run it better than sort of we are now? Or where are we failing? Do you see that we could do it better under a sort of a fully nationalized system?
Yeah, so I don't think there are many politicians right now who are willing to say out loud in public that that there is, in essence, that the NHS is systematically failing. Obviously, there are problems because we have a waiting list of 7.6 million people. But the NHS is actually fundamentally very, very sound, right? In 2013, the NHS was ranked as the best healthcare system in the world. It's been found in all sorts of analysis to be among the most efficient healthcare systems in the world. And the reason for that is quite clear. The model of health insurance that they use in the US is interesting in that.
Oh, it's interesting. Very interesting.
It's interesting in that the way that health insurance companies make their profits is by making sure that they have a larger percentage of people who are healthy in their quote unquote risk pool, so that they're paying health insurance premiums every month, but then they're not using it. They're not asking the health insurance company to pay out to the hospital. They do pay out, of course, to those that are sick, but it depends on having more people that are not going to use it than people that are going to use it. What we have done in the NHS is that we have made that a system that brings everybody into the risk pool, right? So we have whatever it is, 65 million people in the UK who use the NHS. On average, there is about 4 or 5, 6 or 7 million people who use the NHS so consistently. And there is all of us who are paying for the system but are not using it very regularly, right? And the advantage of that then is that it's able to provide a really good service to those few people who need it as often as they do. And the effect of this is that it's really, really efficient. We don't have a massive bureaucracy like they have in the US that have to process your insurance claims and decide whether or not to accept your insurance claim. We don't pay our nurses and doctors at the level that other countries pay their nurses and doctors. Part of this is like that our nurses and doctors in many ways are devoted to the NHS itself. So they're willing to accept lower pay. But we've also seen that there is a bottom to their patience and acceptance. And we have crossed that bottom for hundreds of thousands of them already. And so what's really important is that I don't think anybody can justifiably argue that we can't publicly run the NHS. We have been the best at it in the world for some time. What the NHS is suffering from is not that it needs more privatization, is that it needs less privatization. Because what we are seeing with privatization is money leaving the NHS in the form of profits, right? What we're seeing with privatization is that they're creating more work for the NHS. And something that people don't actually know is that politicians will tell us that private hospitals can help us cut waiting lists. The reality is that every single month, private hospitals send over to the NHS 550 of their own patients who have an emergency while in the private hospital. They send them over to the NHS, and that creates more work for the NHS. There's been some research that showed, for example, that when you outsource cleaning services to the private sector, it creates more hospital-acquired infections, which the NHS then spends about £1 billion a year having to fix. Right. So the problem.
Yeah, I didn't know about that. That's interesting. I thought that would sort of shocks me quite fundamentally, because I actually had again a friend who sort of been in that situation. He went to hospital and he caught a MRS. I think it is the disease. So that sort of shocks me as well. That is a statistic that you don't often hear, unfortunately, which kind of shocks me that isn't sort of being sort of talked about more. But no, that's wow, yeah, wow.
Yeah, I mean it's academically peer-reviewed research as well. It's not just like some think tank who came up with the figures. It's out there, and people in academia are well aware of the effects of privatization. And you may be aware, more recently, there have been a pair of Oxford University research that have come out. One of them came out in 2022, I believe, or 2021, one of those years, that linked outsourcing of NHS services to private companies to up to 557 preventable deaths. And more recently, I think in March, the same researchers produced another research that compared the effects of outsourcing health services across different countries, and the effect on it on the quality of the service. And what they saw was that when you outsource a service, the quality of that service reduces. And the reason for that is that private companies, in order to make profit, they hire fewer staff, and they tend to prefer to treat those patients that have less complicated conditions, because they just want to perform the surgery and hands off. Whereas when the NHS treats somebody, performs the surgery, the NHS actually follows that person through the process to make sure that that person comes out perfectly on the other end of things, right? So it's privatization is the problem and not part of the solution with the NHS.
Do you think that, obviously, all the stuff that you've said there, and obviously we're not hearing more of this, do you think that this is just information that, even though it's out there, it's not being disseminated more, do you think? Or again, is there something more nefarious at play in a way?
No, I don't think there's anything nefarious about it. I think that people don't know the details of it, but our polling shows that people are quite familiar with the gist of it.
Yeah.
And as a result, our polling is also quite consistent in showing that people overwhelmingly, regardless of who they vote for, conservative voters, Labour voters, Plaid Cymru, Green, Lib Dems, whoever they vote for, they're opposed to NHS privatisation. They're opposed to privatisation of public services, period. Right? So it's not so much that there is a nefarious effort to prevent people from knowing about this. There's obviously people on the other side of this argument who often lie about the effects of privatization, and that sometimes has the effect of obfuscating reality. But the public quite knows the gist of things. They know that
it's more like almost an information war, really, about what was the classic Terry Pratchett phrase, the truth can, a lie gets halfway around the world before the truth can get its boots on. I think it's something like that. But yeah, it is sort of that phrase, and it's not just obviously in this conversation sort of about nationalisation versus privatisation. I think it's almost in every aspect now we are seeing more and more of that disinformation sort of be spread almost about everything sort of political now. But yeah, so I think obviously in that, I think we're very, very much on the same page. I want to see sort of more sort of effort sort of be put into sort of keeping the NHS sort of always sort of free at the point of use, keeping sort of sort of the private hands off the NHS. I believe one of the campaigns it used to be called, I think it still is. But no, so I think I'm very, very much sort of in favour of sort of keeping that running and keeping that going. So I think that's sort of really sort of the NHS, unless you've got anything more to sort of add to.
I just wanted to add to that. I think it's a really good place to add to it. So I mentioned earlier on that we are demanding that candidates for Parliament commit that they will support these three policies I mentioned, right? Investing £40 billion more into the NHS every year to catch up with the rest of Europe, ending bringing outsourced services back into the NHS when their contracts expire, and reinstating the health secretary's legal duties to provide health services in England. That campaign is called the Pledge for the NHS campaign. And I've put the link, or you put the link in the chat a moment ago, and people can just click on it. We've prepared the system. We prepared a tool that essentially, thank you so much for going to the website. And we prepared the tool that essentially allows you to put in your postcode on the website. The reason that the postcode is important is that it allows the system to sort for the candidates in your constituency. You put in your postcode, it takes you to a letter that we have already prepared that you should send to your candidates. All you need to do is put in your information, click send, and it goes to all the candidates in your area. Some candidates have not
making it as easy as possible for people to use, because there's some times where some campaigns don't do that, and it's just like, if you want people, I've got a marketing background, so I know how difficult it is can be. When you want people to do something, you've got to make it as easy as possible. So that is really good that you've sort of already done that, and we've seen so many successful campaigns do it that way, and that is, I think, a really good sort of proven campaign way to do that. Pre-prepare something just for people to add their names to, and they will do it. Do you have any sort of figures at the moment, how many people have sent that, or sort of responses as well from people?
Yeah, so in terms of how many people have done it, at the moment about 11,000 people have emailed candidates in your area, but that's because we've only pushed the campaign once, right? We sent out one email to our email list, and 10,000 people took action, and then we heard back from a number of parties complaining about the volume of emails that they were getting. So what we decided to do was that we held off on sending or on asking more people to send the email, because we thought that this provided us an opportunity to engage with these parties behind the scenes to try and see if we can get them to support these policies. And some of them are moving in a good direction, and perhaps we'll have something to announce on that front soon. But others are not. And what we're doing now is that we're going to begin ramping up the effort of getting people to email their candidates again. And pretty much beginning now, you can put in your postcode, send the email to your candidates, right now. In terms of number of candidates that have taken the pledge, almost half of the SNP parliamentary candidates have taken the pledge, so about 21 of them. 5 Plaid Cymru candidates have taken the pledge. I think in total there are about 12 or so Plaid Cymru candidates, so that's a good percentage of them. About 7 or 8 Lib Dem candidates, which is quite interesting because you don't necessarily expect the Liberal Democrats to support this kind of thing, but they're showing that if you put enough pressure on them, some of them are going to support it, and that's really important. Very good lesson for us to get from this. Something that we've noticed is that we're not getting a lot of Labour candidates taking the pledge, and we recognize that the reason for that is that there is a lot of Labour candidates are not allowed to do a lot of things without central authority from Keir Starmer or West Streeting. So we are focusing our campaign in terms of Labour on West Streeting and Keir Starmer, because if we can change their minds and get them to agree that this is an important thing for them to support, then their candidates are going to follow suit. We're talking with the Green Party behind the scenes, and hopefully we're going to have some good news on that front.
Cool, excellent. So definitely something to look forward to. And of course, well, you know, a general election could be literally, well, maybe next week. This time next week we might know. Who knows?
I think we need about 6 weeks before it happens, between when it's announced and when it happens, I think.
Well, that's what we're waiting for, the announcement. And the only man who knows that, of course, is Rishi Sunak.
Rishi Sunak.
So obviously we now sort of talked about the NHS, and of course we've just had the Labour announcement about the plan to sort of renationalise the rail. The plan is sort of the Great British Rail, although technically it was something the Tories brought in of, this is not nationalisation, but it's, you know, dancing around, not saying the word as much as they could. I am glad that Labour has come out and just said, yeah, we're just going to sort of bring these things back in public ownership. So yeah, tell us more about what you think of that plan and what you think of it.
Yeah. So to start with, it's a really good policy that Labour has announced. It's something we've been campaigning for, but it's only Great British Railway in name, right? Because the Great British Railway is the offshoot of something called the Williams Review. The government commissioned Keith Williams to review the railway system and identify the problems with it. And Keith Williams reviewed it and said, well, the core problem with it is fragmentation, which is a really interesting way to say that we have too many private companies, all of them trying to take profits for themselves, and nobody really working for the passenger. And their solution was to create what they call the guiding mind, like a central thing that works the entire system, but it retained the private companies within the system. And obviously, we knew that that was not going to work. Not that they actually have yet got the opportunity to implement it, but that was not going to work, because you still have private companies whose interest is to make a profit from the system, and they have people employed whose job is to make sure that they make a profit, and to make sure that every other part of the system is working in the interest of their making a profit. And every other company is doing the same, right? The system is pulling in several different directions. So what Labour has announced is to say, well, we're going to get the private companies out of the system, right? We're going to create one publicly owned arm's length company. That company is going to take on the responsibilities of every train operating company. So there are two kinds of companies in rail, or three. I'll say there are three kind of segments in rail, right? The train tracks themselves. People might remember Railtrack was nationalized by the Blair government, interestingly, after a series of accidents. Railtrack was a privately owned company. They did not invest in the infrastructure. It caused a bunch of accidents. People died. The Blair government took it into public ownership. It's now called Network Rail. So we own the tracks. We own the stations, by and large. The second thing that exists on the trains on the train systems are the trains themselves, right? In terms of the trains, though, We don't own the trains, right? There's something called rolling stock companies. There are three big ones that are private equity backed. They own the trains and they lease the trains to TOCs, train operating companies, the companies that actually run the trains on the tracks. So companies like Southeastern and others. And what Labour is going to be taking into public ownership are the train operating segment of this, right? Those companies that lease the trains. Well, it's not going to take the companies themselves into public ownership. It's basically going to say, you have a contract to run a train on this line until this year. When that year reaches and your contract expires, we're not going to renew it. We're going to take that service and run it ourselves. They have not said, actually, they said that they're not going to take the rolling stock into public ownership. The reason that they give for that, I think, is quite disingenuous, right? They're saying, we're not going to pay money to shareholders to buy over these trains and own the trains ourselves. Believe it or not, Labour can actually do that and it will save us money in the long term. But even if they don't want to do that, they could still themselves create a rolling stock, publicly owned rolling stock company that can buy its own trains and help update the system. So it could buy its trains, and over time, it could turf out these privately owned rolling stock companies. It's not going to happen immediately. And even what they're announcing is not going to happen immediately. It's going to happen over 5 years, right? So they could fix the rolling stock issue. And something that we need to know about the rolling stock companies, when British Rail was privatized 30 years or so ago, the average age of our trains was 16 years old. The average age of the train that's running on the tracks in England, it was 16 years old. Can you guess what the average age of our trains is today?
Well, as someone who's a regular train user, I can probably guess 25, maybe
20.
30. Yeah, 20.
Right. The average age of our trains right now is 20 years old, 4 years older. And in train years, that's a lot, right? And that explains all the breakdowns, all the delays, and all of the crisis, really, that we encounter in our railway system today.
Do you think that's the logical next step, that if you introduce this policy to begin with, and as you've said, it's going to happen over time, do you think that's then the next logical step to bringing in a nationally owned rolling stock company then?
I think that they can announce that immediately, right? There's no reason why it needs to follow this, right? It's something that they can say. They could say, and they might be able to put it in a way that's consistent with what they believe, right? They could say, we don't believe in paying money to shareholders to buy over these companies, but one way that we could approach this is to say we're going to create our own rolling stock company, and over time we're going to buy our own trains, right? Which means we need to lease trains from these companies less and less. That's something they can do immediately. It doesn't require them to first of all run the trains before they can do that. So I think that it's a really good thing that they've announced. It's good that they have agreed with campaigners. We've campaigned on this for a long time with the RMT, the TSSA, ASLEF, and other campaigners such as Bring Back British Rail, the Association of British Commuters, the National Pensioners Convention, DPAC, Disabled People Against Cuts. These are organizations that have worked together over the years to put pressure on the government to take some rail lines into public ownership. And that's something that's actually been happening already under the Conservative government. And to ask the Labour Party to have a broad policy of not doing it piecemeal, but taking the whole system into public ownership. And it's good that they've agreed in terms of the trade and operating companies. They should now go further and commit to bringing the rolling stock companies into public ownership.
Yeah, I can definitely see that happening. I mean, when you look at, I'm sure as you know yourself, when you look at sort of the polls about, nationalisation, it's always sort of rail that comes almost at the top of these polls. So I can almost see this being just an automatic win by them doing this. So I can probably see them going down, if you pardon the pun, down the track. I can definitely see that happening.
The great thing about campaigning for real nationalization is that there are so many good puns that you can use. We always talk about we need to end the gravy train.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, well, be careful now, because we'll just one pun after another and we just won't stop. So we'll get off at this station.
Yeah, let's get off at this. That's so funny.
So yeah, I really do think that, honestly, that probably will be the next step, because to me it just seems, well, if you've done this, the next logical step is as you said, just to create a publicly owned rolling stock company. So I do think we could probably see that happen. Maybe, as you said, they could do it now. Maybe this could eventually become a plan. Maybe it ends up in the manifesto. Who knows? But again, I can very easily see that being the next logical step for them to take on that journey. So, yeah.
Can I add one more thing to this and connect the rail issue a bit to the NHS discussion we had earlier? And the reason this is useful, and hopefully we could talk a little bit about water as well, because it's one of the big issues now. But there are two ways that you could take public services back into public ownership, right? One of them is allowing contracts to end and then bringing the service back into the public sector without paying a penny to private companies. The second one is to buy back those assets. And which one you go for depends on the nature of that service, right? So if, for example, you cannot bring water into public ownership without buying assets back, we think that it will pay for itself within 10 years if you buy it back. But we're not hiding from the fact that you will need to pay out money to buy it back. Unless, of course, that private company is Thames Water and it goes bust and the company is effectively worthless, right? So that's one way. The other way is to bring back contracts when they expire. Now, Labour appears to be suggesting, by the rail policy that they've just announced, that they're willing to carry out public ownership or end privatization where they don't need to spend any money to do so, right? Where they don't need to buy anything out from private companies. And I think that, well, that's fair enough if they're not willing to talk about spending a lot of money. We think that they should be bold and talk about what the country needs, and that is public ownership of our water, of our energy, of our public services. But assuming we kind of follow their logic and say, we don't want to spend money, but we're going to do public ownership where we don't get to spend money. Guess what? For the vast majority of the privatization in the NHS, you don't actually need to spend any money to end it, right? A lot of those contracts are short-term contracts, 3 years, 4 years. I got a spreadsheet from a company that helps private companies get contracts in the public sector. I got a spreadsheet from them that includes a list of NHS private contracts between 2020 and 2023. And the vast majority of those contracts end around 2030. That means the Labour government will still be in place, theoretically, by the time almost all of those contracts expire. So they could do exactly the same thing that they've just announced in rail in the NHS and say, we are committing today that we're going to bring back all contracts that expire back into the NHS. We're going to build that capacity to provide it within the NHS so the NHS can provide it. That is something they can do immediately. The fact that they're not doing it is puzzling to me, but that's something that we're going to be putting pressure on them to do. If you're going to make this commitment in rail, the same mechanism, the same logic applies in the NHS. Let's apply that logic to the NHS as well.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that is again, that's the way to go. And I suppose the danger always becomes of the danger of that strategy is, what if you don't win in 2030? What if you're trying to run out the clock, and of course the Conservatives won again. So I suppose as that is a strategy, the danger is, well, you lose the next election, they renew the contracts for another, I don't know, 5, 10, whatever, how many years. So I suppose that is always sort of the danger of that sit and wait strategy. But it is, if you don't want to spend any money, I suppose it's technically the best strategy.
I think So just quickly to come back a little bit on that point, I think that the popularity of public ownership of ending NHS privatization suggests that doing this actually helps them ensure that they win the next election. Not this one that's coming, but the one that comes
Yeah.
after their first term in government. It all but guarantees it. If they do it, and the government is the public is tired of underfunding, of austerity, and of privatization. All our polling shows it. You go on a website, we have polling on pretty much all of the public services. They show that the public is tired, they're fed up. And doing this in government shows the public that they can trust you to put the public services before the profits of private companies. And that guarantees, that helps you win the next election. It doesn't hurt your ability to do so.
And I think that's something else that is worth talking about, because obviously when we were, well, I suppose when they were being sort of privatized by Margaret Thatcher back in the day, British Rail did not have the best reputation in many ways. So I suppose one of the things that the government sort of has to do is it has to sort of show that these services can work and can be run more efficiently. And that is, as you said, it's all about sort of making sure that sort of the money is going back to the system, reinvesting in the system, and making sure, well, essentially the trains run on time. Certainly better than they do now. I think any improvement on the rail would be, a better improvement in many situations. Like I say, I have to deal quite regularly with the Trans-Pennine Express, so I am used to cancellations.
Well, good news for you then. The government took it into public ownership late last year, so great.
Yeah. Yeah, so like I say, I'm looking forward to sort of that, and sort of that improvement of services, because like I say, there are one of the things they did announce as well was creating the rail passenger group
Standards
as well.
body.
That will be good. Yeah, that will be good to have a group that is specifically just looking at rail passengers, what they need, and how we can sort of help them as well. So I think that is a good part to that policy as well.
Can I add something to what you just said? That I totally agree with that. I think that's a really good part of the policy. Something that they should avoid, though, is at the moment we have a bunch of charities. I don't want to name any of them because I don't think that they are evil, but there are a bunch of charities whose job really is to rubber stamp whatever the government wants to do. Sometimes they don't, and that's good, right? The way they recommended against closing the ticket offices earlier this year when the government wanted to close 1,000 ticket offices across England. So that's good, but in the vast majority of cases, they're not doing very much. And it's important that this body, it's founded in a way that actually gives it real power to fight for
more.
passengers.
It's government run but independent. I want us to know.
Exactly. Yeah. So it needs to have real power to represent and fight for passengers. We and other campaigners are doing that job now, and we will continue to do it, whatever happens, and we will hold that body responsible. But we also believe that it's better as well if there is another body that the government listens to more than it listens to campaigners, that is saying the same thing that campaigners are saying. That's a good thing.
Yep. No, I agree with that as well. So actually, keeping on the theme of transport, and particularly we'll time it in the local elections, bringing local bus services back under local ownership, that seems to be one of the big things that we are seeing a lot of the regional mayors pushing. Obviously, Andy Houchin just completely smashing two people together there. Andy Burnham, sorry. Andy Burnham has already sort of started that process in Greater Manchester with sort of the B Network. We're seeing the West Yorkshire Mayor, she's kickstarting that off as well. We've seen sort of Supertram being brought back under sort of public ownership as well in sort of Sheffield, to the Sheffield City region. So if you want to sort of talk more about that would be great as well.
Yeah, so my colleague Matthew Topham, who is our, we used to call him our boss's campaigner, but he now does a lot of our work on water. But we have somebody who was hired specifically to lobby for politicians to, especially those regional mayors, Andy Burnham, Tracy Brabin, what's the other one's name? Forget his name.
Oliver Coppard.
Oliver Coppard, exactly, yes, Oliver Coppard. And obviously Cambridgeshire and other parts of the country, Liverpool City region as well, that are moving in the direction of taking their buses into public ownership. So I think a lot of that is part of the work that we've been doing with campaigners on the ground in those areas. And it's really important. The reason our theory was this, obviously, we think that if we're able to show somewhere in some places the benefits of buses being run for local people and not for some multinational corporation like First Group that runs buses in England and also runs buses in the Netherlands, doesn't care about either of those groups, just cares about the profits that comes out of it. We can show the impact of public ownership and public control, then number one is that we're going to be better able to force the government and the Labour Party to adopt those things as policies, but we're going to begin to move in that direction much more holistically as a country, right? And I think that what Labour has just announced is a demonstration of the success of that strategy, right? Where Andy Burnham bringing the buses in Greater Manchester into public ownership has been able to demonstrate to other mayors that this could actually work, because they have what they're calling the B network in Manchester that's doing a far better job than other of the privatized companies. And then, of course, now Tracy Brabin has taken the step to begin the process of taking their buses into public ownership. The process is moving ahead in terms of they have to obey a bunch of rules that the government has put in place, apparently to discourage them moving in this direction. So they have to be really careful how they move. But the process is also moving on with Oliver Coppard. The Liverpool City region is quite advanced in that process as well, right? So I think that Labour almost could not avoid this policy now, because all of the mayors that are doing this are Labour mayors, and they're incredibly successful. I don't know if you've seen the polling for the election in Greater Manchester. Andy Burnham has something like 65% of the votes in the polling, compared to the next person who has like 12%, I think, right? So it shows that this is popular. Yes, it shows that this is popular, and it's really, really important that we are now following this kind of process, right? Labour in government is going to give local authorities the ability to take their buses into public ownership and public control. I think this is a brilliant policy, and we always criticize politicians and the Labour Party when they do something wrong, but we also give them great credit when they do something right. And this is an area where we've given them incredible credit.
And I think it is great that has happened. And I think this is, as they say, from, small seeds to big trees grow. And I think this is an example of that thing of these regional mayors do represent a really big opportunity to sort of do small sized policies to show how they could benefit on a national level. So I am very, very much in favor of these regional mayors and sort of giving them sort of more power. And like I say, I think they're going to be proved very, very successful. As like I say, said already, Andy Burnham's going to have probably even greater success in that. Hopefully, fingers crossed, hopefully Ben Houchin loses, because I know transport is one of the big key things that people in North Teesside are talking about on there. And of course, the Labour candidate is himself talking about bringing buses back into sort of public ownership there. So that will be good if we can sort of get that, as well as the Teesside stuff as well. So it's
quite interesting. I did want to just add, obviously, I think it's really useful if you are in Newcastle or in the surrounding areas. I believe the election of Jamie Driscoll is in that area. Obviously, We On It does not endorse candidates, but if you want to see buses run for people and not profit in that area, you should vote for Jamie Driscoll. I think. I would say that something that is interesting about Ben Houchen is that he's been able to hold on to being the mayor of that area, not the Jimmy Driscoll area,
Teesside, yep.
the
Tees Valley.
Teesside mayoral, by doing some things that are not very traditional of Tory politicians, right? He took the airport and the area there into public ownership. That's something that you would not see a Tory doing, and he was boasting about it as well. It's not like he did it secretly.
Yeah.
And that shows, I think, the kind of popularity of doing this. And if the candidates in the area, whichever party they're part of, is able to demonstrate to the people that they are going to put people before the profits of private companies, they're going to be rewarded in the polls. And it's really good to hear that the Labour candidate there is putting local bosses front and center, because that's a big issue for people.
Yeah. Well, if actually speaking of airports, Doncaster Sheffield City Region Airport, owned by Peel. Same, I think Peel used to own the Teesside one as well. I think it was. They sort of closed the airport because people weren't using it. But whenever I flew out from there were always people waiting in the terminal, coming and going. It was a big cargo airport as well, just because of the size of the runway. It was next Harrier bomber sort of site as well. So the runway is massive, so it could accommodate really sort of big planes. And that hopefully is going to be coming back under public ownership again through Sheffield City Region. And that coming into sort of public ownership again will be, I think, a really big benefit to South Yorkshire as well. Something else I wanted to sort of bring up as well: bus and sort of interconnected travel networks as well, because it is good to sort of have, when you're sort of thinking about transport, to think about how all this stuff sort of interconnects as well. One statistic I know for South Yorkshire, I'm not sure about everywhere else, but 1 in 5 people, when they go for a job, so they'll go through the application process, they'll do the interview, and then they'll turn down the job because they can't actually travel to the location. They can't get there in time.
That's incredible.
And it's one of those things that just again needs to sort of be brought up, and I always bring that statistic up because it just goes to show you transport is one of the most biggest important things, especially when it comes to local stuff. And I think regional mayors having that power is going to be very, very popular. I think Andy Burnham's led the way on this, and I think other regional mayors will lead the way on that as well. And eventually, as we say, we've seen Supertram go into sort of public ownership, so that's something else that will sort of again connect the entire network together. And again, you connect that with sort of train as well, and then eventually one day, maybe not yet, long way off, but maybe you will be able to sort of just travel the UK just solely on public transport and not have to sort of worry about anything else, because you can go from a train to a bus to a train, back onto a bus, everywhere you need to go. So that is eventually sort of the dream sort of that.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. Public transport in England is in the UK as a whole, really, is quite, I don't want to use a terrible word. I wanted to say deplorable, but it's terrible, because a friend of mine who lives in Newcastle, and we were talking last night about me going to visit her, and I decided to look at Trainline to see what it would cost me to go there on Sunday, since Monday is a bank holiday, so I could afford to travel during that period. I saw tickets that would cost me, for a trip that's about 4 hours, I think, on the train, would cost me about £245. That is nuts.
Yeah.
How do we expect people to use the train? Like, if I hire the car, I don't have a driver's license, so probably doesn't make sense for me as an analogy. But in theory, if somebody hired the car, if somebody got a taxi, in theory, you could go to Liverpool, not Liverpool, you could go to Newcastle for 1/4 of that on a different non-public transport option, right?
Yep.
It's quite incredible the way that we have made our railway system so unaffordable for people. How are we going to make people come back into the system, which is really important for fighting climate change, right?
I think this is the other thing as well. When you look at Europe, Like you go to Europe and the train fare is just so much lower, and then you look at sort of how it's run there, and it's depending on where you are, it's a vastly different mix of different things of privatization, nationalisation. A lot of regulation goes on there. Their network is a lot more sort of passenger focused, where the UK one historically is very sort of not transit focused.
I should just say quickly that the best railway system in the world is the Switzerland's railway system, and it's 100% publicly owned. And it's people talk about the Swiss tax rate being very high or things being very expensive in Switzerland. It's actually more expensive to travel in the trains here in England than it is in Switzerland. Like, obviously, if you plan your travel in England 6 months in advance, you might get a relatively cheap ticket, right? But if I decide right now I'm going to get up from here and I'm going to travel from Oxford to London on the train, it's going to cost me far more than if somebody got up from their house and got on the train in Zurich and decided to travel the same distance as between here and Paddington, for example.
And,
right? So
and going back to the whole fragmentation system, how bad it's fragmented, how bad that is, you are almost, if you are going to go on someone else's line, the cost increases if you're sort of buying a ticket, because then you're going to another operator.
Yes,
the system is making you buy from two operators that is increasing the price. The infamous one is was it the Glasgow to Edinburgh ticket? That if you buy that for the same price, you could buy a ticket to just go all over Germany for like the entire year and just use all their rail network for a year. It's like,
yeah, and it's something that I discovered recently, and it's weird because I'm obviously a campaign on rail, but I did not know this, that my rail card, I have a rail card for I've forgotten what the age range is. It doesn't actually apply for some, like if I'm going to some places like Newcastle. So the price I got, I would have to pay the full price because my rail card does not apply to going to Newcastle.
Yeah, I missed my student rail card. Yeah, the trick was as soon the day before you were about to turn 26, you went and renewed it. So at least you had it for like another year or so.
Yeah, it's quite incredible that we have a thing in our rail system that applies to some part of it, but not to other parts of it. That's just irrational. It makes no sense. And that's because of the fragmentation of the system and private companies all across the system trying to extract profit from one part of it or the other.
Yeah. I suppose let's bring this to something else that I would sort of love to see, and that's HS2. I personally would love to absolutely see HS2. I've talked with I don't know if you're aware of him, Gareth Dennis, big sort of train expert, sort of talks a lot about sort of UK trains and sort of the rail network on both on sort of online on YouTube and sort of everywhere else. Had a conversation with him as well, and I think re-improving the rail and sort of using HS2 and sort of when you've nationalized it, you can use all the profits to sort of help build HS2 because it's something we desperately need to sort of help improve sort of rail networks. But what do you think would be sort of your opinion on sort of HS2 and sort of getting that built?
We don't talk a lot about HS2, partly because it's not a big public ownership issue in that way. So I don't have a lot of expertise on HS2. I've heard a lot of like green people talk about the impact on the planet, which I think is important to keep in mind. Yes, but outside of that, I believe that it is important for us. This is just my general belief, that we build a rail system that works for the 21st century, right? And in other countries that have been able to build high-speed rail and other kinds of rail systems that work for the distances that they're talking about, yes, and if HS2 or whatever rail project takes that into account, and if we can, if our assessment is that in the long term, it helps reduce the effect on the climate of people using their private cars and stuff like that, then I would imagine myself being supportive of it. That is as Johnbosco, not as we on it. Yes, but I don't have a lot of expertise on HS2, to be honest. I'm giving you the opinion of the person who, if you went out to the street right now and you ask somebody, what do you think about HS2? I'm telling you, I'm giving you that opinion, but coming from me.
Yeah, like I say, maybe one day I'll HS2 pill you, and I'll convince you that HS2 is the thing to do. Maybe, but that's a conversation for another time, because I am very, very passionate about sort of building HS2. It's something infrastructure-wise the UK rail network drastically needs. It will massively improve the capacity, which is the main problem of the current sort of UK rail network, that the lack of capacity.
I totally agree with you that we need more capacity on our rail system, right? I agree with that. The question is that I'm not the guy to talk about whether or not that is HS2, right?
No, actually, another time. Another time. But yeah, so we've always been talking for, well, we have been talking for almost for an hour now. Yeah, is there anything else sort of you want to talk about or mention or shout out or anything like that?
Just to remind people that will be viewing this or are viewing this right now, please do go to weonit.org.uk, click on the sidebar there that says Act Now, and look through the list there. You're going to see the option that says Pledge for the NHS, email your local candidates. Click on that, email your candidates, and it's just been put in the chat again. Email your candidates and ask them to commit to pledge for the NHS. Pledging for the NHS means three things: to support more investment of £40 billion more into the NHS every year for the next Parliament and even beyond, ending NHS privatisation in the NHS, and finally, reinstating the Health Secretary's legal duty to provide health services in England. If we're able to win on these three fronts, I think we have a really good shot of actually saving our NHS. And I think we have a good shot of winning. So everybody, each person, it literally takes 2 minutes to do this. We mentioned earlier on, we make it a point in our kind of preparation for campaigning. We ask ourselves, can we make it easier to do this task? And we've made it so easy that you could go from start to finish in 2 minutes. And I literally tested it. So please do click on that link and take action. And fingers crossed, I think we can win this campaign.
Cool. Excellent. So yeah, I think that's that. Well, I think we've covered everything for the moment, at least. Definitely, absolutely. Thank you very much, like I say, for coming on. I think it's been an absolutely fantastic conversation. And like I say, these are the types of more conversations I want to have with sort of more campaigners about their campaign and sort of what they want to see and what they want to see done. And of course, like the eventual goal of sort of their campaigns. So I think having this conversation is fantastic. I want to see sort of more of these conversations, not only just happen sort of in sort of general news, but online as well. So like I say, thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you for having us. Really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. Like I say, anytime you want to sort of talk about anything or anything like that, like I say, let me know. We'll sort of set something up as always. But thank you very much for coming on. It's been absolutely fantastic having you on. So yeah, like I say, thank you for everyone else watching. Please do remember, like I say, click on the link below if you want to go see, like I say, the We Own It. I will leave a link below after the comms. It is in the chat. You should be able to sort of gain access to that. But you can find them just by typing We Own It in Google, and you'll find them very, very easily. Other than that, like I say, click the like, click the share button. Links down below for myself, and of course, We Own It. So until next time, of course, we'll see you all very soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.